thank you so much to everyone who is joining us. Most especially, thank you so much to Jaret Vadera for joining us, a Canadian artist who is, lives in a hyphenated world. So Canadian, Indian background, and but living and working right now in Brooklyn, New York. So thank you so much for joining us for this field trip program. For those who are tuning in, Field Trip is a nationwide, cross Canada, coast to coast to coast, a collaboration of 45 plus institutions across Canada. Was initiated by Contemporary Calgary. They sort of had this core idea, and other folks, joined in. And so everything related to Field Trip can be found at fieldtrip.art. But for today, the Power Plant is really honored and privileged and excited to speak with Jaret Vadera, who creates works in, we'll say, cross-medium works that touch on all sorts of interrelated themes, which we'll hear about: migration, invisibility, representation. We'll get to, as the title of Jaret's slideshow demonstrates, alien. So alien, sci-fi, and futurism. So thank you so much, Jaret, for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Josh. And I really appreciate having the opportunity to continue our conversation and to share my work with all the people. I can't see everybody in the Field Trip Zoom session, but thank you all for sharing your Sunday afternoon with us. So I'll just get right into it.
Awesome.
I'll talk a little bit about a few different kinds of work, a few different bodies of work, and some of the underlying ideas in them, and then I'll transition at the very end to screen a short video that I recently made called Unidentified. So let's get going.
Awesome.
All right. Okay, so I wanted to start off first with this work that's titled Dollar Store Dragon, and it's from a series of work called All That Glitters. And in the All That Glitters series, I take some of my old shoes, my old worn out shoes, with holes in the soles or with the rubber kind of coming off, and I resurrect them and I reimagine them. I trick them out using duct tape and paint and other things I find in dollar stores.
So I like that you describe, and we'll get to some images, but as we go, you describe sort of this tricking them out. And when you and I were chatting, we mentioned, well, I mentioned the idea of like bling. And so as we go, if you could, sort of incorporate like what does that mean, and how does that differ in some ways from what you're striving for?
Yeah, I think there's definitely different kinds of bling. And the kind of bling that I'm interested in these works are a kind of dollar store bling, a kind of vernacular bling. And the series is inspired by science fiction, sort of my own experiences of migration. There's this whole practice in Japanese pottery called golden repair. And I'm also drawing from the super tricked out maximal aesthetics of Filipino jeepneys. So there's like a kind of cultural context and sort of a process-based context to the kinds of ways that I'm tricking things out or salvaging them or making them a little bit more fabulous than they would be otherwise. It's kind of like a bittersweet ilk of fabulousness. So not quite the like ice and bling of like rappers and ballers, but more like the kind of makeshift ways that migrant communities put things together and make things work.
Sure.
Yeah, and it's actually, it kind of references some time in my early childhood, like in Toronto, and my father and my mother, they immigrated from the Philippines and India just a few years before I was born in the 70s. And I was born and kind of grew up for a bit in Flemington Park. and then it's Scarborough. So there's something from that time and from those neighborhoods that also kind of trickle into this work. And you know, I live right now in Brooklyn, and there's an underlying sort of like aesthetic or a feeling or something in the air in all of these like working class sort of immigrant communities that I remember growing up, but I also see in different neighborhoods in Brooklyn and in Queens. And for our audience who's not as familiar with Queens, Queens is so much like Toronto in many ways. At least that Toronto that I'm referring to is really multicultural, very hardworking, working class people there too.
Yeah, I mean, my parents are both from the New York, New Jersey area. And so, like, when I think of Queens, I think of Scarborough or Brampton or Etobicoke. Like, there are certain at Parkdale, there are certain neighborhoods that have that same kind of feel.
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually, it's funny. Everywhere I go, I love to like go to like dollar stores. I like to like walk around in dollar stores. And there's a really interesting cacophony of, like camouflage and different colored plastics and really, like tricked out faux diamonds on t-shirts. And there's some, weird aesthetic that doesn't quite make sense, but it completely makes sense in another way. And so whenever I'm in like a new neighborhood, I like to actually seek out the 99-cent stores or the dollar stores as well. It's kind of like a thing that I like to do.
So, speaking of which, so tell me about this particular, shoe work, sculpture. Sort of, what's some of the rationale behind the materials that you've used here?
Yeah, so what I do is I normally I find stuff in those dollar stores as I'm going for walks around, and I source some of this stuff from actually dollar stores or a dollar store in Flemington Park, and some in Brooklyn and some in Queens, and then the necklace actually comes from a local pawn shop slash jewelry store with bulletproof glass and everything. It's anyways, there's different elements. The idea of duct tape in general is a metaphor for making do and putting things together, but it's also got a material quality of actually putting things together and keeping things functioning. So you see like duct tape and you see different kinds of things being put together, and there's sometimes like a beauty in it that isn't quite intentional but then becomes kind of magical. So part of like using the duct tapes is to metaphorically reference like the kind of spit and duct tape mentality, but also to really literally repair some of the shoes and then kind of create these sort of color combinations or juxtapositions between materials. There's a it's a lottery sort of ticket thing that's integrated into this one as well.
Right.
You see, that in many sort of communities that are striving to make it to the next level. Lotteries and scratch tickets are a big part of like, the visual culture, and also there was just this love for me of these kinds of name necklaces that I wanted to integrate as well. There's uh, there's a history of people wearing, these kinds of necklaces, and they're not necessarily considered, high class or, they may even be like, bad gold. But there's something about the name jewelry that I also wanted to bring into the work because there's an aspect of this kind of bittersweet fabulousness bling that does kind of it kind of like embraces the vernacular of just like of just being like out there and being like unashamed and being like beautifully present in all of your like glory. It's the name of the series is All That Glitters, right? And all that glitters normally refers to this idea that all that glitters is not gold. But part of the idea that I'm interested in is that all that glitters may be gold. And it's, this kind of idea of a value shift.
Oh, for sure, for sure. And I think there's something, in Beyond, the previous necklace, there's something of like that, as you say, bittersweet aspiration. And then in the next with Alien, there's, you know, that sense of, you know, like, do I belong? How do I belong? Notions of belonging, or not belonging, as the case may be.
Yeah, and that's part of the idea, you know, the first slide and then the installation that I'll talk about in a second deals with this idea of the double meaning of the word alien, right? And I actively wanted to kind of flip the script and shift the narrative from one of exclusion and hardship and foreigner to one of ingenuity, of creativity, and magical possibility.
Wonderful. And
Yeah, this
so, yeah, so this installation shot, you were telling me about when you were installing this.
Yeah, this was at the Queen's Museum, and like I was saying, the Queen's Museum is Queen's is quite similar to Toronto. So when I was, you know, we were talking about this series of work, they were really interested in it, and I installed it and actually called the installation Alien Alien, and you know, it's 9 slippers and shoes, and you know, like we were talking about, you know, in inverting the idea of the word alien, that's often used to incite fear or kind of a protectiveness. But I'm really interested in the idea of the alien as something otherworldly, as supernatural, as magical. And it becomes kind of a way out of the dominant narratives, but also just a way to free up one's imagination and my like set loose and free my love of science fiction, which is, you know, another kind of theme in my work.
Sure. I think there is, I mean, I think there's like a little undercurrent, maybe in the last 20 or 30 years that is in pop culture that's like trying to make Alien, the idea of Alien in a sci-fi sense, less scary. So, you know, like I think back to, you know, when you and I were younger, there was the show Alf, and then there was the series Third Rock from the Sun. There was Mork and Mindy, with like literally quote unquote aliens, as characters who were like benevolent or at least not harmful. So I think, you know, hopefully pop culture will continue that ascent of the idea that alien, which is ultimately it's a metaphor for people in our everyday lives who may not be like us. But hopefully there's this good trend of demonstrating, you know, all these folks are like ultimately fundamentally good folks.
Yeah, that can be, I mean, that's the hope, you know, like, you know, science fiction is a huge, um, you know, it's a huge industry, and it's really important to think about how we talk about the future, how we talk about aliens. I mean, in TV, for sure, Alf and Mork and Mindy were a kind of softened, you know, idea of the alien. Um, but in films and in Hollywood movies, I feel like around the same time, the kinds of aliens we were seeing were um, hyper violent, you know, really scary. I mean, a lot of the movies that came out of Hollywood were, you know, coming out in the 80s when we were younger, 90s, that's like the height of Cold War paranoia,
Right.
right? So there's a way that films kind of capture the zeitgeist of the time and the kind of Jungian shadow, the feeling that's kind of in the air as well. So I would love to see, you know, more positive representations. In Canada, you actually have a really great show. What is it called? Expanse. It's I think it's produced in Toronto, and you know, there you have a really interesting way of looking at like a multicultural future that's not just tokenized. It actually feels quite
Yeah.
possible and plausible. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. So, so I mean, it seemed like when you were installing this, the folks in the museum though were pretty, or even the visitors were like pretty intrigued by this series.
Yeah, I mean, this series has become like one of my most, it's funny, it's like one of my most Instagrammed works. And as I was installing the show, I was having all these conversations with the curators and the people in the museum. But as I was installing, many of the workers in the museum, started coming up to me, and many of the caterers who were there for an event just kind of like were swarming the work. It was really amazing. In some museums, there is a disconnect between the cultures of the people working, security and the blue collar jobs in a museum versus the people who I normally am speaking with. And it was really quite encouraging, that I was showing these in Queens, and then there were, people kind of coming up and like, oh man, and everybody was telling me a story. Like, this reminds me of, the 80s and, when I was young, and this is like really hip hop. And this is, I remember we used to paint on our jean jackets. And I just love that, because part of, being an artist is that you sometimes end up in these silos, like in these, white boxes that feel, like they're disconnected from the world. So it was really nice to connect in a way through something that's hyper personal to
Yeah.
something that was hyper personal with someone else.
Yeah, I mean, I always think that, ultimately the test of really, interesting, intriguing, thoughtful art is that it's like immediately relevant. That once it's made and like put out there, that audiences, viewers will look at it and have a connection, feel that it is really relevant to their lives and that it speaks to a larger issue. So I think, this series just really just amazes me. I think it's um, much more profound when you think about all the underlying implications.
Thank you. Do you want me to go on to the another?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, so it's funny that we just kind of talked about the ease of legibility in some ways, because these works operate in a very different way, where they are kind of supposed to be more of a slow burn, and something that you come to and are not quite sure what it is, but then try to figure it out as you move through the piece. And this work is called Ascending to Outer Space to Find Another Race. And it's from a series that's inspired from Rorschach tests, infographics, fMRIs, and maps. And, in the series, I was thinking about parallels between neuronal networks, the internet, search engines and perception, language and its limits, and the ways that technology shapes how we see, what we see, and what we don't.
Wonderful. So, I mean, to me, that sounds like uh, uh, a step away from something that's like purely visual to something that's um, more tapped into language, more tapped into analysis of how we communicate, and how we think, like literally how we think in words, and what those words then ultimately mean. Is that
Uh,
something of what's going on?
no, absolutely, absolutely. There's a lot of different layers to this work, and that's a major one, right? It's how to speak in a language where there are no words for what you're talking about. It's how to operate in a world that doesn't quite have the right algorithms. And so, that's partially where the title comes from, this idea of ascending to outer space to find another race. It's this idea of trying to move beyond the network that we've inherited, or the system, or the language, or the social constructs.
And so how does the title relate to what we are now seeing on our screens?
Yeah, I can show you. I have a few more slides to talk about the process.
Yeah.
It's a very labored and intense process. I really think through in every body of work that I make, the ways that processes can generate meaning, and they can tap into uh, different value structures and then kind of collapse in on my work. And so what I do to make the image is I first do an individual image search, for each word in the phrase, which is ascending to outer space to find, and then I look up race as well. And then I download one of the first images that comes up. I drop the color, and then I combine it with the others to create like a new abstract aggregate form. And so this is, the main kind of body of this piece here. And then I go and I do something, I add another layer to it, and I add another kind of process to the mix, is I figure out where in the world each of the images was downloaded from. And, we're used to thinking through Google or through search engines. We do a search, type in whatever we want, and all of a sudden there's, 100 results on the page that show up. But what we don't see is actually that first result comes from Japan. That second result is coming from New Delhi. The third result is coming from California. And we actually see this world in a kind of seamless way, but we don't really think and understand the physical ways that information is transmitted through the internet. I mean, there's been more and more discussion over the last few years about algorithms and how they work. But this body of work has been kind of developing for years now. And it was really like started at the time when everybody was just like, the internet, it's like the shiny new everything, and it's going to be the great equalizer. And, I knew that it wasn't true. And something that we know now is that if you're in Toronto and you do a search, it's very different than if you're in Dubai and you do a search. It's very different than if you're in, other countries that have restrictions or whatever. So there's ways that these algorithms influence the way that we see, and many of them operate, they're like black box algorithms. They operate in ways that we don't really know or understand. And so this is like the bottom part here. So there's, information that I gather when I do those searches of where the servers are. And I then integrate the physical location of each server, the search term, the name of the file, and I superimpose it on an invisible world map. Mm-hmm. And then I take out the map. So there's a tie between like the immaterial and the actual physical.
Right. And then in its installed form, this is directly on the wall. Is this vinyl or is this paint or?
Yeah, it's I've tried installing them in different ways, and that's part of the experimentation process that I do with all my work. But what I've found is that the best way to do it is to actually take that image and then do a big vinyl cut, which in effect, for those of you who are not familiar, it's like a big sticker. Basically it's like a huge sticker actually, and it's cut out and put directly onto the wall, and so it actually does feel like it's painted on, and the bumps of the wall kind of come through afterwards. This version of the piece is about 12 feet wide by 5 feet high, and it's just above eye level, so you're kind of looking up at it a little bit. Mm-hmm. And just to play up that idea of kind of a UFO sort of object, and it's part of an exhibition. At least this exhibition in this constellation, it's in proximity to this other work beside called Chronomad, and the title of the show was The Closer I Get, the Further I Find, and it was at 12 Gates in Philadelphia.
Great. Yeah, I mean, it's like this shape of ascending to outer space to find an alien race definitely feels like, to me, it feels like the silhouette of a spaceship, almost like a vessel, and it feels like it has a direction, like it's moving off to the left. It sort of has those like action lines shooting out the backside. So then how does this relate, because you mentioned now Chronomad.
Yeah, I can, that's the next piece. So that's, right beside it there, and I can talk a little bit about that. So Chronomad it's a performative photograph. And it's from a speculative fiction series about Asian futurism that was commissioned by the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center a few years ago. And as we were talking about before, like science fiction is one of the most wide-reaching and popular contemporary forms of storytelling about the future. And stories about the future are very important because they really influence what we think is possible. And so I started thinking about the similarities between migration as a kind of time travel, or the ways that code switching between languages, or just traveling across any kind of borders or time zones can be seen as kind of like an ontological superpower. And I thought of this word chronomad, because it's like chrono is like time and nomad is this, this kind of idea of traveling between here and there. And I looked it up and I found, and I was surprised pleasantly that the word already existed. And it was defined as a person who travels across time or migrates across dimensions in a nonlinear way. So I was like, okay, this is perfect. This was like meant to be the title.
Right. Awesome. And I mean, I wonder, if you could talk a little bit about how, like Asian futurism, or I'll say futurism and sci-fi might be situated in, quote unquote, non-Western cultures differently than like, we think of Jules Verne and H.G. Wells and, even I'll say like Gene Roddenberry and the whole Star Trek thing, and, George Lucas and the whole Star Wars thing. So, like, what are some of the differences maybe?
Yeah, okay, so of those, Star Trek is probably the trickiest one to talk about. Well, because there's both a super colonial aspect to that representation of the future, right? It's the USS Enterprise, which is, a kind of stand-in for the United States. And, they're explorers using like, rationality, and Jean-Luc Picard is this like ultimate like Sherlock Holmes sci-fi character who speaks in Shakespearean affect. So there is a real part of that narrative that is hyper colonial.
Right. Well, that's just for those who are watching, that's like Star Trek: The Next Generation.
Yes.
So that's
Right.
like that's the era of like you and me as youth.
Absolutely. And that was like a really important series for me. And because it was free of borders and free of lines, and because it was such a fantasy that I could imagine myself in there. And so the reason I said it's complicated is because Star Trek, the franchise, has also been quite utopic and inclusive in these other ways as well. There was in the first series, there was the first interracial kiss. There was, there were a lot of really amazing moments through the series with a Japanese American Sulu, or an African American person on deck. And there's a really nice story. I won't get into it right now, but if you have a chance to look up Uhura. Uhura was a really incredible character in the first iteration of Star Trek, and there's a conversation that she has, and there's a video of it where she talks about like wanting to leave the show, and then she actually meets a fan who turns out to be Martin Luther King. And Martin Luther King says, no, you're not allowed to like leave the show. This is really important that you're on the show, and you can offer a representation of a possibility of people in the future. So I think that there's a way that some ideas of the future can be complicated and hold multiple sort of uses at the same time. But when I'm talking about Asian futurism, or we talk about Afrofuturism, indigenous futurisms, Latinx futurisms, there's a way that modernity and coloniality have integrated this idea of progress and a kind of future that has been one of extraction, has been one of conquest. And there are ways that, even in like a science fiction story, there's a re-embedding of these, colonial and violent histories that are sort of consent is manufactured through them uh, because there is kind of like a utopian idea within them, but they actually they can be quite damaging and quite problematic. So thinking through the cultures that were overlooked or were bulldozered over, or that don't fall within the rational idea of colonial rationality, is kind of an area that a lot of the other kinds of futurisms look at. It's not really centering around like a North American or a Western European idea of progress. It really centers around our customs, our ideas, our ontologies, our ways of seeing that aren't necessarily just about like the future that everybody needs to be part of. It's actually about the past. It's also about history. It's also about different ways of seeing the world around and within us. And it's also about ways out of the current sort of algorithmic biases that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important point, that futurism and sci-fi, it's an envisioning of what will be or can be, but it requires a certain a priori foundation of where we are now, and where we are now. If we look at the past differently, focusing or emphasizing different aspects of the past, our perspective on the present changes, which then has that ripple effect of changing how we see the potential future. So I think that's like really important to underline as a foundation for sure.
Yeah, and I think it's also an intrinsic part of representations of the future that they become dated very quickly, because the future is, in any representation of the future, is always a representation of the present, right? So if you look at sci-fi from the 50s, from the 80s, from 2000s, they're all very different. Like the aliens are different, the colors are different, the visual culture is different, the makeup of the crew is different in some of the sci-fi things. So I feel like the future is this like foil for talking more deeply about the present. I believe, and don't quote me on this, but I believe that part of the Star Trek franchise, one of the things that they talk about is the Prime Directive. Okay, I'm going to be kind of a nerd for a second, right?
Right.
And the Prime Directive is this thing where when they go to other planets, they're not supposed to interfere with them, right? It's like non-interference with other cultures, and that actually got put in.
Sort of like the butterfly effect.
Well, it's also like the idea idealistically is that you're not supposed to meddle in other people's affairs.
Right.
And it was, it's a plot point, and it's a consistent sort of moral and ethical point that was injected into the show in response to the Vietnam War, right? And in response to the USS Enterprise's interventions in their global campaigns for neo-imperialist domination. So I think there's like all these other ways that sci-fi kind of has implications as well.
Yeah, for sure. And so I wonder, for then Chronomad, what should we be looking at in this image? Like, what are some of the visual cues that we should be taking?
I think, in terms of prescribing what people should see, I really like people to come from wherever they are and see, whatever it is that they're bringing to the image. And, that it's part of the ethos of my work is to kind of think about work more as a mirror than a window, more of a question than an answer. And I know what I see when I look at the work. And one of the things that I'm interested in is this relationship between anthropological images and images within representations of the future in sci-fi. And I'm also, I was thinking about like, moving across spaces and carrying your world on your head, uh, or just like what it is to travel in this kind of like background, which is this space, which is a very particular light that I'm thinking about. And there's a concept called chair en loop, which is this that refers to when a dog becomes a wolf. And the artist and writer Trinity Minha talks about the time of dusk or dawn as this moment where two lights meet, and where you have like the light of the moon and the light of the sun. And I was thinking a lot about this, this space and that kind of like quality of light, because I just love that time of day, or those times of day. And there's something interesting about like these two lights coming together and how they potentially open up like another space, like a third space, or like a portal into a kind of like shape-shifting world where a dog can become a wolf can become a dog, and they can kind of become this other thing altogether.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for explaining that. And so I think we have one more series of works.
Yeah, I mean, there's I can show this is what, another installation,
Right.
and, something that I'm not talking about as much, because I'm showing individual works, but really the experience of the work is supposed to be one of discovery. There's a bit of context given, but I really like playing with, that boundary of when something, when something can like pull you in to fill in the story, and how to make work that's kind of ambivalent or multivalent in relation to other works, to create these kinds of cognitive ghost images between the work, and to like have people enter in and exit and enter in different ways. So this installation is called Aliens, Dead Zones, and Beyonders, and it was at a show in New Orleans at a gallery called Good Children. I might have wanted to show that because I like that title as well.
Yeah, say that once more.
Aliens, Dead Zones, and Beyonders.
There you go. Yeah, I mean, I think you raised a really interesting point, and it, nowadays, I think a lot of people think that, artists send off their work and a curator takes that work and puts it where they want, and a show opens. But I think it's really important that people understand that curators and artists work very closely together to make sure that the visitors to an exhibition are sort of having those sort of like purposeful encounters, and that those encounters are like well paced, hopefully, are, that there are certain juxtapositions of works that are either building one on another, or that are purposefully at odds in some ways, and to try to help a visitor like figure out the bigger picture, the bigger underlying issues.
Absolutely. And I think of almost every show that I've been in, I mean, except for the shows where they just take an individual object and put it into a group show. I think of every installation that I've ever done as a collaboration between a curator and myself, or an organizer and myself, because it's really a dance that you play. Curators normally know the space inside and out. And, I'm very interested in the site specificity of each installation that I do. And so if you're walking in from this direction or from that direction, it makes a big difference in how you set up what somebody sees first, second, third. And you kind of work all the time with, with different curators. A lot of the work that, I make is commissioned, or somebody says, a curator will be like, oh, I'd love you to be in this show. Can you make some new work? This is the idea. And then it becomes like even more of a dance and a choreography with the curators as well.
Right. And so in this exhibition, there was this video.
Oh, well, this video, this is actually just a still.
Okay, right.
And so this, I'll just talk about it. It's called Where the Ocean Meets the Sky.
Yeah.
And it was a glitch in, Google Street View as I was looking out towards the ocean. And I screen captured it and just turned it into a still video projection. But I can transition into the other video
Yeah.
that I wanted to show and that we were talking about before. And, as I was talking about, working with curators and collaborating, I mean, this is a good case in point. We'll be watching the video in a second. It's about 2 minutes. It's a silent video, and it's a part of a project curated by Sadia Shirazi, and it's an ongoing project, and I think there's going to be an iteration in the UAE this year sometime called Exhibition Without Objects, and it riffs. She asked us, can we, think through the slideshow and think through like slideshows in general, and and make work in response to the title Exhibition Without Objects. So this kind of riffs on the aesthetics of slideshow presentations, and it uses all this found footage that I found or found images of aliens and UFOs that I searched for and found on the internet, because I was thinking about Exhibition Without Objects, and it was just like a short sort of jump over to the idea of unidentified flying objects. And so the piece is called Unidentified. So I'm just going to play it and I'll be quiet for a bit and then we can talk in a minute.
Excellent.
And that's the end.
Excellent. So I know when when you and I were chatting in advance of this, we were talking about slow looking, and so I think with this video we see obviously this theme of unidentified, and see these images with like very short sometimes one word, or like 3-word text. But there's also something of like forcing a viewer to like slow down and really look and maybe think about how each image relates one to the next.
Yeah, I think that, slow looking is really important. I think a lot about slow images. I think about multivalent images. I think we live in a culture right now where, we're just fed constantly, junk food images all the time. And, that's the job of many people, is how do you capture somebody's attention, convince them to buy a product in like 3 seconds or less, So we're surrounded every day by highly legible junk food kind of images, right? And one of the things that, I kind of grew up with, and kind of understood in a very personal way, is the way images can tell a story, and the way images can not tell other stories. So I really like to think through how images work, and how they sort of influence the way that we see the world, right? And so this idea of slow looking is kind of about like breaking images apart and putting them back together, kind of slowing down the ways that we would normally consume them, at the speed at which we would normally consume them, so we can actually figure out what we're taking in. And there's something really interesting about like the space that opens up, once you get past the kind of like shifting in your seat, that looking at something slowly can kind of elicit. There's a new kind of like silence, and stillness, and way that different kinds of possibilities are opened up through slow looking. I think you're on mute.
Muted myself. And I think that there's something really interesting about, just like for our audience out there, this contrast of, these like easily digestible, instant gratification images that are out there, and how it contrasts with the idea of this video in particular, of unidentified things, of things that are not at first glance, easily identified. I mean, it's literally, that's that's the contrast of something that is unidentified. So I think this is a great opportunity to open the floor, if there are any questions from our audience, to use the Q&A, or I think you could even put it in the chat. But I mean, I'll sort of, open with, I guess, one last question, which is to circle back to the idea of alien, and to talk just a little bit more about the double meaning of alien, and sort of, now that we've looked at some of your work that relates to that theme sort of in different ways, how do you envision alien, the title of this conversation we're having?
Yeah, I think, for a lot of my work, and a lot of my work kind of goes in this direction, or was about like this kind of experience where I didn't offer as much context, but you're kind of confronted with an unknown situation, and you kind of have to navigate through it. One of the things that I often think about is translation, and sort of the poetics of translation. What happens as one thing moves between one process and another, right? how does perception work, and how is reality translated through language, through technological processes, through social processes. So there's this way that I'm really interested in, like a lot of the things that are hidden in plain sight, the things that are beneath the surface, the kind of the mechanics of the ways that we understand the world, which actually happen as we're understanding the world, so we don't really see them. So there's always been a presence in my work of like this other thing, like this kind of ghost or this absence. And it's not just about like an absence in the way of thinking of something that's not there. It's about thinking about like a whole potential presence of what's not there, right? And so I actually never use the word alien really. And I was talking to one of my good friends and colleagues, David Antonio Cruz, another artist. And I said, can you tell me, what do you think about my work? Like, how do you see my work? And he said, well, your work is all about the alien. And I never really used this term before. And there's something about like the simplicity and the directness of his, his kind of assessment that made me really start thinking in another way about like, the direct read of the idea of the alien. And so for me, there's a huge history of the term alien that relates to foreigner, some kind of like disease that's coming in, that's going to ruin the purity of whatever kind of ecosystem that we're in, whether it's racial or gender-wise or nation state, whatever it is. There's that. I mean, it's legally used. The term alien is legally used in many countries, and it's an actual designation. And in the last how many ever years, this, at least in the U.S. where I am right now, the discussion of the alien has been like horrifically racist and violent. So there's that understanding of the alien, right? But an alien can also be a superhero. An alien can also be an angel. An alien can also be a god or a goddess or a mythological figure. An alien can just be some kind of representation of something that's out of what we already understand. And it's actually quite empowering. So there is that sort of dichotomy that I'm interested in. I'm not interested in it as a dichotomy. I'm interested in flipping it and turning it into something that is more empowering and something that is more positive, that actually allows for new possibility and kind of like it's not just owning it, it's like looking at one's positionality or multi-positionality as like a superpower, which I think is something that we need to see more of these days, when we're confronted with such binary really like fraught ways of thinking and being in the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to know that when one is of the majority, that process of othering, of otherness, could just as easily be you put in a different context, right? So I mean, it's in that sense, it's always the I'll say it's been my prime directive to treat everyone as a human being, right? As opposed to forcing anyone into a box of my creation that makes no sense, because I certainly don't want to be put in boxes that are not of my selection. So I wonder if we could conclude with sort of a topic that of course is a global issue right now, and sort of in some ways relates to the notion of alien infection of the pandemic. So I wonder if you could speak briefly about what has it been like for you to be a working artist in this time of pandemic? Like, has this in any way sort of entered into your thinking and work, or not?
Yeah, it has been all encompassing and all consuming, like it has been for, I'm sure, many people. And one of the things that you quickly ask yourself as a cultural producer is, um, what am I making and why am I making this now? Like, what's important to do right now? Like, what does it mean to make objects that go into white box galleries? Is that really crucial? And so it's been a crazy time. I've had a number of shows canceled or postponed. There's a number of different exhibitions that I'm in online, and that's been kind of a shift. It's been kind of an interesting shift to see the world kind of move online in another way. But as an artist, maybe I'll answer as a human. As a human, it's been it's been tricky. You want to like there's survival, there's mental health, there are like the communities that are directly around me that are being affected in really hard ways. And so partially what I've been doing is channeling my energy into my work, but also into my community that I operate within. I also have been spending, or at the beginning of the pandemic, for the first how many ever months, I was doing something non-artistic in a way. I was just delivering food to undocumented families, and sort of felt that that was one way that I could be useful as a human, where some people who have been kind of left behind by the system and didn't have uh, any access to kind of the support systems that they needed. Like I wanted to help out in that way. So I feel like being an artist, like it's a tricky thing for me because I've never really thought about being an artist as just being an object maker. I feel like I'm an artist who makes things and then makes things happen. I've also, in the last how many other years, started teaching, and so one of the things that I've also been doing is trying to figure out how uh, to work with younger people and have them navigate this situation as well, as as a teacher, and sort of discuss in my pedagogy some of these major issues, to kind of arm my students as well and protect them and help them protect themselves in these really weird and troubling times, which didn't just correspond with the pandemic. They corresponded with a number of you know sort of protests, and a rash of violent sort of killings and beatings of people of color. So there's a lot going on all at the same time. In addition to you know being trapped in their houses, there's a lot of other stuff that people are trapped in their houses looking at and watching and trying to figure out how to be present in the world while there's a pandemic going on.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's like the dangers are not just alien, as in like foreign, not of the earth. They there are, unfortunately, these real social and political problems, that at times feel insurmountable, that seem overwhelming. But I think um, it's really helpful for those of us who are not culture object makers or experience makers, to have artists like yourself who are making objects and helping us have these experiences that hopefully help us understand, a little bit more of what's going on in the world. So on that note, I am ever so grateful to you for participating in this field trip program. Um, I know vastly more about your work now than I did when we started. I hope our audience out there does as well. And we will definitely look forward to, we'll say, the futurist work that you make.
Thank you so much, Josh.
Absolutely. So for those who are tuning in, our next field trip in May will feature a Power Kids workshop activity. And then in June, we will be in conversation with Stanzy Tooth. So Stanzy Tooth, a Toronto-based artist, in conversation with the Power Plant's TD Curator of Education and Outreach Fellow, Josephine Denis. On that note, thank you so much, Jaret. Check yourself out on fieldtrip.art and the Power Plant's YouTube channel, and we will be in touch later.